All right, everybody, welcome back to RCT Construction. Just gonna apologize in advance on this one. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so if my voice sounds a little off, that would probably be why. And I might be going in and editing out some sniffles and coughs and stuff like that. But you know what? I'm feeling pretty motivated to get this RCT Construction done here. So we're gonna go ahead and get kicked off with the new for 1997 edition to Funland. We're going to get kicked off here. You can see we have some marks in the dirt. So I kind of pre-planned out this route a little bit in advance. I had someone suggest that Funland get an Aero Hypercoaster for the 1997 season. I guess not necessarily the 1997 season, but just at some point. And we're going to go in a pretty similar vein to that. We're going to go with kind of a spin-off of Aero in a way. We're going to go with D.H. Morgan Manufacturing. They are most known, I think, for probably the Cedar Fair Morgan trio, but we'll get a little bit more into their history in a moment. But we're going to go ahead and get kicked off with our layout here. We're going to start with the bottom of the first hill, which I have marked out there in the dirt. It's going to come back down to about 15 feet. This is probably the third time, I think, I'm attempting to record this, because the first one I did a live com, once again, was not a fan of how the live com turned out, and tried to do a dub over, didn't like it, and then now we're doing this one for the third time. So getting kicked off, we're going to have the lift hill be 235 feet up in the air. So this is going to be a pretty big Morgan Hyper. We're going to have it drop down to that 15-foot mark, and then we're going to have it go up for the first airtime hill. Now, for Morgan Hypers, that's typically the most common, and as you can see here, I'm kind of demonstrating what most Morgan Hypers would typically do. And by most Morgan Hypers, I mean the Cedar Fair trio, so they would go back up into a second hill and then kind of go straight out and then curve back for a massive helix and then start making their way back towards the station. However, the first hill on those rides delivers excellent airtime, and we want to get a little bit more of that, so we're going to do 3 hills, actually. We're going to do a first hill, which is similar to Steel Force Mamba. And then we're going to do a second hill, which is again similar to Steel Force and Mamba. Then the third hill is going to be very similar to Wild Thing at ValleyFair. So it's kind of taken all 3 of the Cedar Fair and Morgan trio and then putting the best of each one in there. And then I looked at the lift hill a little bit there. And the reason I did that was because I noticed when some people build these Aero or Morgan Hypers, they'll go straight into the kind of turnaround, or like the big steep drop. And what I typically will do is build the lift hill and then do 2 downward slopes and then kind of get into my steep one, because if you ever look at the Morgans, they tend to do that. There's like a 2-stage drop, and when you're in the back row of those cars, the whip over those drops is absolutely incredible, because you'll start speeding up while you're still going up the lift. You'll get airtime over the crest, and then when it steeps down to 60 degrees in the drop, you'll get even more air, and you're just out of your seat the whole time. So that's typically the way I will design my lift hills. As you saw, we did a massive close to the ground helix, which is sure to be very intense. Once that's done, it kind of serves 2 purposes. It gets very intense, as I said, and then it burns off a good amount of speed as well, to start slowing the ride down on the way back towards the station. So when it hits the mid-course, it doesn't fly in too fast, and it just is able to trim off a little bit of speed heading back towards the 7 airtime hills we have heading back to the station. And now coming back out, we're going to start building in reverse. We're going to build the final brake run there. As we do that, we're going to set up kind of our transfer area. We're going to build the turnaround, which is going to be a downward helix to kind of have the train build up a little more speed heading into the transfer. And this is going to be very reminiscent of both Steel Force and Mamba, as opposed to Wild Thing. Wild Thing has it's just a different kind of final brake run, where it has a bunch of brakes, it turns, has more brakes, and turns again and has more brakes. Whereas I feel like the other 2 are more seamless when it comes to their final brake runs. And right there, on the return trip, I'm kind of redesigning some of the airtime hills. So originally it was built just like the pre-design layout. However, with the way the land works, I found a nice way to kind of include a Apollo's Chariot-ish kind of dip, which is way steeper than expected. On Apollo's Chariot, the final hill into the brakes is way steeper than you would think, and it caught me off guard the first time I rode it. And I really liked that, so we're going to implement that on this coaster as well. And then we're going to start heading back towards the station and kind of design these final hills on the way back towards the station, and just kind of make sure they're nice and smooth all the way back. So that will be our layout for this ride. We can kind of see it testing. Want to make sure it has a decent amount of want to make sure the pacing looks pretty good, and I think the pacing ended up looking really good for this ride. And then we're going to start building up kind of the station area for the ride here before we head into the fitting out process. But that's the layout. Let's go ahead and switch on over into fitting out. And by fitting out, what I mean is we're going to go ahead and start kind of getting the scenery placed, kind of figure out what we want the area this ride's going to look like to get put together. And we're going to go ahead and get kicked off with that. We're going to get the station platform underneath there. I don't really want it to be that dirt texture. I kind of want it to get a little bit more of a concrete feel underneath. And we're going to get our transfer track set up as well down there on the bottom hand. And I've said it multiple times on how I do my transfer tracks. I like to have them set up so you can have the extra trains sit there if they're not in use. It might not be for everybody, but just for kind of the realism aspect, I like to be able to, if I want to pull a train off because the park's not very busy and kind of lower those operating costs, I can. I don't think there's any effect on that in-game, but just for aesthetics, I like to have them there. But anyway, what you do is you build your two station pieces, or you build your station piece, build back the amount that would fit the train. I kind of have the brake set up there so it would fit. And then I have the colors slightly different. I think I have the supports being gray as opposed to the light blue that the actual ride has. But then you set up your stations, you build your entrance and exits over the actual track of the ride. Again, be careful when you do that if it's next to a path, because if you build those entrance and exits over a path, it will actually block the guests from being able to walk down it, which is not necessarily good. I learned that the hard way when I built Landslide for my Mega World park. My park rating dropped significantly, and I ended up finding out there were a bunch of guests trapped and they couldn't get out. So not ideal on that front. So I had to make sure that got corrected. But if you build over the track, the trains have no issue at all heading over and returning to the station. We're going to go ahead and get our transfer track set up. I tend to not use other rides for my transfer track. I'll just use plain scenery pieces so it looks like the transfer can slide over. I'll use the tile inspector and then just kind of make that station piece invisible and just replace it with another set of brakes so it doesn't look like there's any station there at all. And then you reset the mode to reverse incline launch shuttle mode, and then you make sure to set your maintenance to never so that mechanics don't try to inspect it, because if they have an entrance and exit and they have the option to inspect, then your mechanics are going to disregard a lot of things to try to get those transfer tracks inspected when they do not need to be. Once it's in reverse incline shuttle mode and you set the I tend to set the guest count to full trains, just so if I accidentally ever open them, they don't dispatch. And then once that's set, you can set the test and then close it, and then you'll have a train chilling on your transfer track. Now we're going to go ahead and get kicked off on building the lift truss structure. The Morgans typically used, I think Steel Eel at SeaWorld Orlando uses more plain supports, whereas the Morgan Trio at Cedar Fair will use these truss style. Superman El Ultimo Escape uses the truss style, but there's a couple rides that will use the plain supports, which is kind of the nice thing about the Morgans, is you can kind of build them however you really want to get them built. But the truss structure is going to take over. I had to kind of modify this one right here so we could fit the truss structure over that turn heading back and kind of keep the symmetrical feeling all the way down. I think it turned out pretty well. The only difference I have, most of them are 2 wide with 2 spaces in between. However, the top of the lift was 3 wide, so it just looked like it was a little more souped up at the top, where like the turnaround for the lift gear would be, or the lift cog would be on the chain return. And now as we get into kind of building the railings here, I'm going to go ahead and delve down into the history and kind of the coasters of D.H. Morgan Manufacturing, because this is a long and tedious process that just takes a long time, and I kind of want to talk about something a little bit different here. But first, as far as how this works, I will typically put one wall on one side to kind of make it match up. On this one I did 2. Because Morgan is kind of a spin-off of Arrow, I wanted to make the lift truss look the exact same, so that little orange piece is not going to end up sticking around once I get it set. It will be deleted, but the other side will keep the yellow railings and all that. Then you use the tile inspector to get them set up so they look like a railing guests can hold on to on the way down. I tend to use a lot of vanilla scenery pieces because I like the way the vanilla scenery pieces look a lot in game. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump on into the history of Morgan Manufacturing. So Morgan Manufacturing was founded by Dana Morgan, the son of Ed Morgan, who was a founder of Aero Development. As far as Morgan goes in terms of their coasters, what they did was they took the Aero track design and they kind of tweaked it a little bit. So where Aero's track design uses, I believe, 5 weld points, the Morgan ones only use 2, and the cross ties are welded completely through the center spine of the track. So with Aero, you have the center spine and then the cross tie is welded on the top of that center spine. It goes out on either direction, left or right, is welded again to go straight up at a 90-degree angle, and then it's welded again to the running rail. And so right there you have 5 weld points. You have the center spine, you have on each side to go vertical, and then you have on each side to connect to the running rail. With Morgan's design, it's a little more smooth. The cross ties are more kind of plate-like as opposed to being a bunch of different steel pieces. But the cross ties are welded, I believe, all the way around, but it might not be quite all the way around. But they're welded to that center spine, and there's a lot more weld there to keep it stronger. And then the cross ties are all one piece, and that is then welded to the running rail. So as opposed to the 5 weld points, the Morgan ones only have 3. So the track is a little less of a bear to maintain, and then the weld points are a little bit larger as well, so they tend to be a little bit stronger. As far as Morgan's coasters go, their first one that opened was Wild Thing at ValleyFair, the first of the Morgan trio. However, the first one built was actually Quicksilver Express over at Gilroy Gardens. Now, Quicksilver Express was built, and I want to say 1995. So it was built and constructed. However, a bunch of like the trains, a lot of the other fitting out stuff was left at the Morgan facility because the park was not ready yet. And then in 2001, I believe, is when they were finally able to get everything put together and get that ride open. So while Quicksilver Express was the first one built, Wild Thing at ValleyFair was the first one to actually open in 1996. So Wild Thing stands at a height of 207 feet and features a top speed of 74 miles an hour. It was the first of the Morgan trio, so Dick Kinzel, who was the Cedar Fair CEO at the time, was a big proponent of if you build it, they will come. And after the success of Magnum XL-200 at Cedar Point, they figured might as well get a couple more of those at a lot of their smaller parks. And keeping in mind, this was before they owned the Paramount Park, so Kings Island, Kings Dominion, Carowinds were not in the picture yet. So Cedar Point basically was the cash cow of that company. And then they had ValleyFair, which helped make the name Cedar Fair. You had Dorney Park, which was their 3rd park, and I think Worlds of Fun was their 4th, and I don't believe they owned Knott's Berry quite yet at this time. But all their parks ended up getting these huge Morgan Hypercoasters. The first one going to ValleyFair in Wild Thing. The next year, Steel Force at Dorney Park would open, and then Mamba would open in 1998 at Worlds of Fun. I have had the opportunity to ride all 3 of these. In their original form, the first time I rode them, Mamba was the first hypercoaster I ever rode. Very, very good ride. The first half is very solid. Again, the airtime in the back row, insane. The airtime in the front row, insane as well. And then Wild Thing would have been the second one I had the opportunity to ride. And the nice thing about Wild Thing is the first hill is just a speed hill. So the first hill after the lift on that one is very drawn out and not horribly tall. So there's a lot of airtime that you get. It's a huge floater hill. And then you go into kind of the big turnaround section, and all 3 of the coasters feature big turnaround sections. Mamba and Wild Things are the most similar, where they go up about 150 or so feet, it looks like. And there's just a big set of straight track, because at the time, you did not go up that high very often. So it kind of gave you a sense of scale of those rides. Then you drop down into the turnaround. Steel Force features a very similar turnaround to Mamba. However, it has a dip in the middle of it. before it kind of dives down. So you don't get the same sense of scale, I don't think, that you get on the ones on Wild Thing and Mamba. But after those helices, you ended up going into a nice set of mid-course breaks, and by nice set, I mean it usually tends to trim off a lot of speed. ValleyFair back in the day actually used to run for coaster enthusiast events. They would run Wild Thing trimless, and when it would hit the final breaks, you could actually see sparks. I want to say David Ellis actually has a video of Wild Thing running trimless, and it has a video of the train flying into the final breaks, and you can see sparks flying off of it because it's hitting in so hot before it finally slows down and comes to a stop. That's how hard the brakes were hitting on that ride. Unfortunately, I want to say in the mid 2000s, I don't know the exact year, but Wild Thing actually ended up derailing. I don't know what the cause of it was, if it was, the train was coming in too hot, but after that, the trims on Wild Thing ended up being very, very strong, and they don't let up on those trims to this day. Even after it got reprogrammed in the late 2010s, the trims on Wild Thing still hit really, really hard. Another thing to note with the programming for these rides, originally, all three of them, when you got to the top of the lift, would slow down. So the front row is kind of dangled off the edge, so you could look down at that 200-foot drop. Again, in the late 90s, there were not a lot of opportunity for that. So it really kind of, and I remember hearing a bunch of people talk about it the first couple times I went to Worlds of Fun, and just kind of, they would just remember how crazy it was that you were just kind of dangled over the edge. Anyway, moving off the Morgan Trio, in 1996, the Santa Monica West Coaster, which might be, outside of the Coney Island Cyclone, the most famous roller coaster in the world, featured in Grand Theft Auto. It's actually in the game Inzoi as well, but it's featured everywhere. A lot of Nickelodeon shows have it, featured. I mean, it's just everywhere because it's just outside of LA on the pier. It looks really cool. After Mamba in 1999, Steel Eel at SeaWorld San Antonio would open. While not a hypercoaster, I believe it stands at just above 150 feet. It's still, SeaWorld still calls it a hypercoaster in their park, even though it doesn't necessarily fit the 200-foot definition. And as far as the definition of hypercoaster goes, I probably should explain that. A hypercoaster, by definition, is any coaster that stands between 200 and 299 feet. And originally, when Magnum XL-200 opened, the hypercoasters did not feature inversions, although in the modern times, around now, 2025, that's a lot looser than it was back then. After Steel Eel, it would be Steel Dragon 2000, which was Morgan's shot at a Giga roller coaster. And then also in 2000, 2001, you had the reprofiling of Steel Phantom into Phantom's Revenge. So Steel Phantom was an aero roller coaster, aero looper that happened to have a 200-plus foot drop on it. Although it doesn't stand over 200 feet, it is still considered a hypercoaster, but Morgan came in, put their new track on it, and then replaced the inversions with a few airtime hills. After that, you'd have Superman El Ultimo Escape in 2002 was when that ride started construction. However, due to permit issues with the Mexican government, it did not open and finish construction until 2004. So Morgan built 8, they built 8 of their own roller coasters and then refurbished 1. So I consider their coaster count to be 9, with most of them being over 200 feet tall. Anyway, moving on to our construction here in the background, you see I've spent a lot of time. So this coaster, called Xenon 200, is themed to an alien invasion. So we're going to have the turnaround be around this huge crater where this meteor hits, and this is where the new creatures start spawning from. I thought the idea was kind of cool to have this huge helix be around something, so we ended up putting this down here in the middle. And then with the track being so low to the ground, we're going to want to make sure to put some restricted area fence around it, just so if anyone ends up in the area, they do not wander into a potentially very dangerous situation. And we're going to do that for a lot of the low to the ground sections as well down the line. So here in the brake run, you can see we're kind of doing the custom supports and normal in-game supports thing. If there's no reason to replace the in-game supports, I'm not going to. I don't think the in-game supports look horrible. Now, that's situational. In some situations, you need to be replaced, as you see at the bottom of the first drop there. The valleys on the trip out, but on the return run, I leave them the same just because I think they look fine for the return trip. The station for this ride looks pretty plain. We're gonna get our queue started here. The location for this ride right behind Cyclone means it's gonna be quite a ways for the queue to go to get lined up for the new section, but the entrance area is going to be at the other side of the downtown section of the park. But while we get the queue set up here, I mentioned Steel Dragon 2000, and I kind of want to delve into the history of that ride just a little bit more, because that one specifically is kind of interesting after I get a sip of coffee here. It's early in the morning. That's better. So Steel Dragon 2000, in the years leading up to the turn of the millennia, Cedar Point was looking for their next roller coaster. And I know of 3 bids. It's possible they could have gotten more, but I know Millennium Force had 3 bids for sure on it. One was from Aerodynamics for a mega looping roller coaster. The second was from Intamin Amusement Rides for what would become the modern Millennium Force. And then there was a third bid by D.H. Morgan Manufacturing, which I believe ended up turning into Steel Dragon 2000 at Nagashima Spa-Land. Now, there was a documentary I watched about that ride, and I cannot find it. I looked for it the other day and just could not find it. But I know that Morgan was pretty unhappy when they did not win the bid from Millennium Force, and Cedar Fair chose Intamin instead. So when Nagashima came a knocking for a new massive roller coaster, Morgan made sure to one-up Cedar Point and build it just a little bit taller. Steel Dragon used the same technology that Dragon Mountain, may it rest in peace, uses at Marineland, where it has 2 lift hills, so 2 separate lift motors. And technically, Steel Dragon can actually have 2 separate trains operate on the lift at the same time. So Steel Dragon 2000, let me make sure I get my stats correct here, stands at a height of 318 feet, has a drop of 306 feet, and a top speed of 95 miles an hour. Now, when it first opened, now, let me just preface this by saying Steel Dragon 2000 was one of my bucket list coasters. I really wanted to go ride it. I really like Mamba Worlds of Fun. I like Wild Thing at ValleyFair. I like Steel Force at Dorney. However, unfortunately, since the trains were replaced from the original Morgan ones to the B&M trains it features now, the seats sit higher up, and I am unfortunately outside of the maximum height requirement for that ride. So that's one of my bucket list coasters that I will unfortunately never get to ride. But that's kind of a little bit of a brief history of Steel Dragon. So it was originally, I believe originally it was a bid for Millennium Force, but Cedar Fair went with Intamin instead. But Morgan went over anyway and kind of built it in Japan, just a little bit taller than Millennium Force, so that they would have the record for the height. Anyway, as sad as I am about not being able to ride it ever, it kind of does limit my ability or want to travel to Japan. Well, I still do. There's a couple coasters over there. I don't know if I could ever go to Nagashima just because I really, really want to ride Steel Dragon. Even though they have Ikugi now, I still don't think I ever could go over there to do that. So moving back over to our coaster here, we're starting to get the queue kind of set up. As I said, it's going to be very, very, very far off and off the beaten path compared to where the entrance is going to be. It's going to be a long way over there. And it took me a little bit to kind of figure out how I wanted to get it placed, just because I knew it was going to be kind of a pain. And as you can see there, we ended up having to demolish the Cyclone's maintenance bay, and then we built our own new maintenance bay over on the far corner of the park. So we have a spot where you can work on both Cyclone's trains and Xenon's trains, and potentially any other flat rides you want to take over their work on. Kind of a more universal style, and not Universal Parks, but just a universal in general maintenance shop that our maintenance team could use. So our queue is going to be a little bit windy. I really like that dip we have that goes around the queue there. That was the intention with it crossing under the lift and crossing back over. So not only do you get the visual from the station if you're sitting in the train of potentially a train flying over in front, you also get the visual in the queue of the train kind of dipping over your head and going around watching all the other guests have fun. So now we're kind of getting to our theming area here, because this was one where I was not sure how I was going to do. I knew I wanted to be themed to an alien invasion, And I knew I wanted the turnaround to be around a crater, but I was not sure how exactly I wanted to set up the final section over there. So I think it ends up turning out pretty well. We ended up having a ton of overflow queue for this ride, so I had a huge anticipation of it being horribly popular. Um, with the 36 passenger trains, you knew the capacity was going to be really high, and even with the amount of queue I ended up setting up here, the maximum wait time for it was about 45 minutes. So with the QTVs, the guests never got too upset, and they still had quite a few say this was their favorite ride. So not too shabby at all. And we get a little bit of shade I wish I'd figured out, but I didn't have the patience to try to build shade diagonally, so I just kind of left it the way it was. But we have a little bit of overflow that has some queue shade on it, but a lot of the guests are going to end up getting sunburnt in the queue for this. Kind of like the way Alpenfury's queue ended up being set up over at Canada's Wonderland before they put any shade over the top of it. But we're going to get started here with this first opening. So what I ended up doing for the entrance to this ride, at the far end of the downtown section, there is now going to be a military base. So we ended up kind of going for that theme. I really like the way Orion at Kings Island is set up with the, I think they call it Area 72 now, because it really just originally was just like the Flight of Fear area, Outer Limits, and then it turned into X Base, and now I believe it's Area 72. And I really like that car that plays the propaganda as you head back underneath Racer. So I kind of went for a similar feeling here. So we're going to have three kind of hangar bays here. The first one, the biggest one, is going to be the entrance for the ride. And it took me, I think, 2 or 3 tries to finally get it to the point where it was big enough to fit everything in there I wanted, because I didn't want it to just be open like that. I wanted to make sure there were some theming elements in there to make it look like the military maybe found something or some technology, and kind of go an Independence Day style route where, you know, they find this, but they're not sure if they're necessarily going to be friendly or not. And then we're going to put in the second hangar bay, we're going to put some theming for maybe a type of electricity that's been discovered with them, how do they power all their vehicles. And then just outside some of the hangar bays, we're going to put some of that space theming in just to kind of add a little bit more, make it seem like maybe a testing facility for the military in the area. It took a while for it to turn out the way I wanted, though. I really liked the rocket placed out front. I thought it looked really cool at the end of the downtown section. And then we end up kind of getting the fence in there. Again, took me a while. The volcano didn't end up staying, but I saw that huge scenery piece right there and decided, yeah, that needs to be in there. Because imagine as a guest walking into one of these giant hangars where the entrance for the tallest and fastest ride in the park is going to end up being, and then seeing that there, and then like being in there, having potentially the lights go out, and then you have this giant, you know, piece of alien technology start lighting up. I thought that would be really, really cool. And then as far as the ride itself goes, when you get in line, you are now a pilot that is going to end up taking the train or the flight, quote unquote, over to the crater to go and investigate it. I thought all in all, the theming ended up working out pretty darn well. So here's my first attempt to try to cover up the finish Hangar 3 is what this area ends up being called. I ended up not being nearly tall enough. Again, I think it takes me 3 tries to finally get it to a point where I liked the way it turned out, or to a point where it looked okay, and I was able to cover up the giant scenery piece in the middle, because this scenery piece is huge. Like, it took it, I think it's like maybe 50 feet tall or something like that. So trying to get this hangar bay set up so it covers it was an adventure and a half. But it's okay. I just turned on the TV series Veronica Mars in the background and watched that as I tried to get this all set up in the background. I think all in all, it took me about 3 hours, 3.5 hours maybe, to kind of get this fire base area completed to a point where I liked it. So there you can see we finally top off Hangar Bay 3, which is going to be like the hangar bay that's kind of classified and secret. And there's going to be a lot of caution signs heading in there. And then what we do on the other side here to kind of keep this queue line covered is we're going to end up building the hangar bay out a little bit more. And this is where like mission briefing will end up being. So you'll get some theming in here in case the line ends up being too long. But it kind of goes a little bit Six Flagsy, I would say, maybe a little bit Cedar Fairy when it comes to beyond this area, because after that, it's just a long winding queue with a bunch of overflow with the ride to kind of theme itself in the background, which is something that Cedar Fair was really bad about. I mean, you look at a ride like Millennium Force, you look at a ride like Mamba, a ride like Steel Force, Wild Thing. These big roller coasters were all just kind of themed to, hey, we have a big ride, and here it is. Especially Millennium Force is really bad because when you're in line for it, you're just surrounded by the ride. There's no theming in the queue at all until you get to the station, and even the theming in the queue, or in the station, excuse me, is kind of the theme song that plays. But all in all, I think this area turned out pretty well. I like that we have the fire base kind of look going for it. Each hangar bay is named. Hangar Bay 2 is just kind of a seating area. Hangar Bay 1, though, is going to be the smallest of the three, and this is actually going to have a little food stand in it just so guests have something to go grab. They can go grab a bite to eat in the new themed area. We ended up doing popcorn, and then I ended up actually moving the popcorn stand closer to the drink stall, and then I put a souvenir stall in there too, so if it starts raining, people can go buy their $20 umbrellas and make the Fun Corporation a ton of money in the process. If you're playing scenarios, make sure you charge $20 for your umbrellas. If it's raining at all, the guest, I know if you're watching this, you probably already know this, but if it's raining at all, make sure you charge $20 for umbrellas because guests will pay anything for an umbrella while it's raining. But we'll get a little bit of seating area installed inside there so guests can sit inside, potentially out of the rain, while they are eating. Because the last thing you want while you're eating, especially something like popcorn, is it to get covered in water because that's just gross. And now we're going to put our signs up there, get them set. We're going to build over the top of Hangar Bay 1. And this is going to be kind of like the mess hall area for the soldiers or guests to go get food before their mission. Once we get that covered, the red ends up turning to gray. I did not like the look of the red the further in we go. I don't remember if I changed that in this video or not, but just know that now it's gray, not that blood red color. Head back over, finish up the exit path here. Get a little bit of theming set up there as well and get that done. Just so there's something for our guests to look at while they're out in the queue that's not the ride. We're going to get the restricted area fence to any areas where the track is really low to the ground. Again, as I said with the giant helix, if you have a section of track that's really low to the ground and you're trying to build a park that's realistic, put a mesh fence or chain link fence around it with a gate so it looks like it's a restricted area. Because if the train ever gets low to the ground like that and you have someone in the area and they get hit by that train, it's not going to be a good time. So just make sure you have something around that low area if you're building a realistic park, because you do not want your employees going in there. As far as the station goes, the station for this ride ends up being very, very plain. Not much to it. The standard roof. I did put a little bit of that abstract glass up top so you can see inside. But I think all in all, the station looks okay. Nothing offensive about it. Looks pretty plain, but that's all it really needs to be. It doesn't need to be anything horribly intense. And then what we're going to do is make sure that the hangar bays get surrounded by fence so that no one can get kind of into the area, because when you have guests in that section of the park, you kind of want to make it feel kind of restricted. You don't want it to feel wide open. You want things to feel kind of close, and then you want it to feel kind of condensed, kind of like we did with Kingman, where you want that medieval area to feel kind of claustrophobic. I kind of wanted to go for the same feel here, but at the same time have enough area for guests to go explore, so it always kind of looked like they were going for something new. Now, this is something that another park probably would do. You saw me go over towards Cyclone there, and now we're going to start kind of setting the trim brakes up so that they don't slow it down to a complete crawl. But as you see with Cyclone there's the blue train. Something a park would definitely do for this time, since Cyclone and Xenon 200 are really close to each other. We're going to I end up recoloring the trains, so the red train becomes orange and the blue train becomes light blue. The white train stays the same. But just to kind of fit the theme, I'm still not used to it. Even though now I'm almost through the 1997 season, it still looks really bizarre because we've been running Cyclone for, 27 years with the red, white, and blue trains, the America colors, but now they're and they look kind of bizarre. Anyway, back to the trim brakes. So we're going to start Xenon 200 by trimming the trains down. Speaking of Wild Thing Mamba and Steel Force, which are the coasters that inspired this one, the trim brakes for those rides were on pretty tight for most of their lives. So, I mean, they would slow down a lot. I remember the last ride I had on Mamba before it got a controls upgrade. I was on the ride by myself, so I got a Zen ride on it, and the train almost stopped on the mid-course brakes. And I really thought it almost felt like, I knew it wasn't going to, but it really felt like it was going to valley before it hit the final brakes. But Steel Force and Mamba both got the exact same controls upgrade. I believe Mamba got its in 2022, and then Steel Force got its controls upgrade at the end of 2023. So with the controls upgrades, Mamba now runs trimless. So I was so excited for that, and let me tell you, that thing runs like Magnum Light now. I mean, it's smoother, but the airtime is almost as good. It's not as violent as Magnum, but it's still really good. To interrupt this conversation real quick, we're going to put a couple of little theming pieces right there. I was a huge fan of Rooster Teeth, the company, before they went under. So, as you know, I built a Ruby theme park, and we're going to call the Firebase Epsilon, which was actually, if you've seen Red vs. Blue, that was Church's Elias as an AI. So that's why I went with Firebase Epsilon. I wanted to go with something from the Greek alphabet. Anyway, back to our conversation about Steel Force and Mamba. So Mamba runs trimless now. Phenomenal ride. I remember I went to Dorney Park and rode Steel Force for the first time before the controls upgrade. And then I rode Steel Force again after the controls upgrade. The next year, I ended up going back for a friend's wedding. And I was so excited to go ride it. And I could not tell you how disappointed I was when we hit the mid-course brakes and the brakes were still on Steel Force. I swear I had a frown on my face the whole time because I was so excited for trimless Steel Force, and it ended up still being trimmed. But that should just about do it for our RCT construction here on Xenon 200. We have our new area of downtown with Firebase Epsilon, and it really brings that whole area a lot closer together, so there's no just open plain of grass on one end anymore. Now it all feels kind of cohesive-ish. But our final results after the testing the ride, our excitement rating of 8.01, so the highest excitement rating in the corporation right now, an intensity of 7.25, very low nausea of 3.56, so medium but low for a ride of this caliber. With RCT2, the max speed tends to be inflated quite a bit because of the way the friction in the game works and the physics of the game works. So our max speed is 87 miles an hour. In real life, it'd probably be closer, somewhere between 78, 79. With the first drop being about 230 some feet. A ride time of just under 3 minutes at 2 minutes and 46 seconds. Ride length of 7,310 feet, and I wanted to measure this up. So I looked at the Beast. Xenon 200 would be just short of beating the Beast's record in terms of length in the US. So let me get the statistics up for that. Beast length of 7,361 feet, so we were 51 feet short of beating Beast. And then the Ultimate would still hold the record for longest coaster in the world at the time because Steel Dragon 2000 was still 3 years off. Very happy with the way Xenon 200 ended up turning out. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you all in the next one. See you later.